So the argument I was making was using inference to the best explanation also can be considered a philosophical move, if you will. And there, I put on the screen yesterday a picture of Peter Lipton, who was the previous head of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge until his really untimely death. He died of a heart attack at 56 playing handball, I think it was, just a couple of years ago. And Lipton was really a brilliant guy. He was an American guy. He came from Williams College, and he did a job talk in Cambridge the last year I was there as a PhD student. And my supervisor put me in touch with him because he was writing this really terrific book on inference called Inference to the Best Explanation, which he published with Routledge in '91. And Peter very graciously gave me the manuscript that he was working on. It was unfinished, but it was, nearly done. And it was really a timely thing for me as I was finishing my dissertation, because I was trying to give an account of how scientists reason when they are reconstructing the distant past. And I'm going to, in a sense, in just a second, take a little detour into a discussion of something called abductive reasoning. And Lipton's account of inference to the best explanation really dovetailed with things that I was doing, and it has proven very useful to me in developing this scientific approach to intelligent design. But I've also thought that it's extremely useful for developing theistic arguments that avoid two extremes that I think have beset the church in its attempt to have an apologetic witness, at least since the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, we had an awful lot of, the medieval theologians often made deductive arguments for God's existence and often claimed a certainty, apodectic certainty associated with those arguments. And when Enlightenment folks came along and started picking little holes and problems in those arguments, then there was a kind of reaction, and you had the existential approach to theology, which was, the leap of faith with no rational basis. And I think there's a middle way in that, epistemologically. And I think inference to the best explanation is one way of formulating arguments that provide epistemic support or warrant without falling into the trap of claiming more than we can claim in our human condition, or giving up on reason as having a role in faith at all. And there's different ways of formulating inference to the best explanation. I think there's other models of reasoning that allow us to steer that middle course. So I'm not claiming in what I'm going to present today that this is the only way to do this, but it's a way that's proven effective. I think it's got some merit, and I wanted to share it with you. So anyway, in my own investigation of this, I came across this method of reasoning because the scientists were using it. And then I came across Lipton's work, and he was developing a full-blown philosophical defense of this, really, but in the context of the philosophy of science, showing that this was a commonly used method of reasoning. It's used in law. It's used in ordinary reasoning. My wife is an expert at detectives use it. Their forensics people use this. And I was writing on inference to the best explanation, and she started, she could reconstruct my movements because of the mess I would leave in the flat. And then I'd say, no, I didn't do that. She said, inference to the best explanation. So it's used in ordinary, in ordinary life. It's used by detectives, it's used by lawyers, it's used by theologians. And I had an epiphany about the demarcation issue when I realized that the logical structure of Darwin's argument in The Origin was identical to the logical structure of a piece of presuppositional apologetics that I had read. And I realized if theologians and scientists are using the same method of reasoning, that also has some pretty profound implications for this attempt to demarcate science from the rest of human experience and say that there's some sort of preferred way of reasoning in science that is not used anywhere else. I just don't buy that. And so I've written against the demarcation, attempts to demarcate science. And but anyway, that's a digression. So yesterday I was using this method implicitly, and in fact explicitly at some point I explained that this is how I developed it. And when I first encountered it in Darwin's work, then I started reading philosophers of science on this, and I realized that one of the key questions, people had made attempts to make an explicit defense or articulation of the inference to the best explanation method, but they kept running up against this question, which was, well, what makes something best? What makes it, because people were saying inference to the best explanation is more of a slogan than a method. And this was Lipton's concern, and he did a dissertation on IBE, as it's abbreviated, at Oxford. And he did a very interesting thing. He spent his 3 years on the dissertation arguing against inference to the best explanation, raising all the objections to it, already convinced that a rigorous account of this could be offered, but he knew it would take more than he could do in his dissertation. So he argued against it, in a sense, doing all the cheap shot arguments against it. And then as soon as he graduated, he set out to write this treatise defending it as a rigorous method of reasoning. So anyway, he gave a causal account of what it means to be a best explanation, a causal and contrastive account. And it turned out to be very similar to what I'd found in the historical scientists, Darwin, Lyell, his mentor, who were saying that what makes an and they weren't talking about it in the way that we as philosophers would do. They were just, in a sense, they had these intuitive criteria that made sense. But I found in Lipton's work and what I was finding in these early historical scientists a kind of dovetailing of criteria. And so in my dissertation, I gave an account that sort of cross-fertilized the philosophical and the scientific resources. But when talking to scientists, the easiest way to get this across is Lyell's dictum that the present is the key to the past, or the phrase I like better is the subtitle of his book, that when we're trying to explain an event in the remote past, we should be doing so by reference to causes now in operation. In other words, it's a principle, it's an ancient principle of sufficient reason or causal adequacy, and it's being applied to the sciences, saying if we want to explain an event, we think of we generate multiple competing hypotheses, and then we infer that one which would, if true, best explain the event. What makes something best? Well, the explanation or the hypothesis that cites a cause which is known to be capable of producing the event in question. Now, of course, that raises all kinds of other questions, like what if you have more than one cause that's sufficient? But this is, in a sense, a rough sketch of the way this whole thing works. I use a real simple example. I'm from Washington State in America. In 1980, actually on my undergraduate graduation day, we had this massive volcanic eruption, and the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it covered the state with white ash. And that ash is still with us today. If you go to the Palouse country, the rolling wheat fields of eastern Washington, and just a little bit underneath the topsoil now, there's still 6 inches of white powder. So if you're a geologist and you don't know what happened in 1980 and you come across that layer of ash, you could use this method to kind of to try to reconstruct the causal history of that event, which is doing historical science. And so you could say, well, all right, we've got this white ash. What caused it? Using the method of multiple competing hypotheses or inference to the best explanation, you could generate some possible ideas. Maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption. Which is best? According to Lyell, and I think most people's pre-analytic common sense, the explanation that's best is the one that provides a cause which is known to produce the thing in question, which in this case is the volcano. Floods don't do that, and neither do earthquakes, but we do know, when we've watched what volcanoes do, that they produce this kind of an effect. So it becomes possible, and this is a really interesting thing that's going to set up our discussion of abductive reasoning, it becomes possible to reason retrodictively from effect back to cause. Okay? And to do so relatively conclusively, with not perfect certainty, because some new facts could come along that would require a different explanation, but we're in a pretty good position. Theological reflection as we go. If we think about the problem of if we think about theistic arguments, especially arguments from nature, this would be different if we're talking about, well, there are many types of theistic arguments, but if we make a theistic argument from nature, we're in a sense trying to reason from the effects, the appearances that we see in the world around us back to a prior cause. So you can see right away that there may be an application for this kind of reasoning to the enterprise of making a defense of theistic belief. So let me just throw that out there for now. So anyway, just a quick review of what I was doing yesterday. So I applied this method of reasoning, inference to the best explanation, and to the problem of explaining the origin of what I called yesterday specified complexity or information, a particular kind of information. And in my dissertation work and then in the book Signature in the Cell that I was cribbing from yesterday, I looked at different kinds of causal hypotheses for the explanation of information. And in a sense, there are many different models that fall in these different boxes, necessity, chance, the combination of the two. But it turns out that these are actually exhaustive categories. And by showing that there were fundamental problems with necessity as a kind of explanation, or trying to explain information by reference to natural law, for example, showing that there were fundamental problems with each of these, it made it possible to infer intelligent design as the best explanation. Now, one of the things I didn't get to talk about because time was short yesterday, but it's crucial, especially in the discussion with scientists who are very sensitive to, Christian scientists in particular, it's sensitive to the God of the gaps problem, okay? And the God of the gaps is a colloquial way of expressing what we would describe as an argument from ignorance, okay, an informal fallacy. And one of the things I didn't get to say yesterday is that this way of reasoning, this type of argument, is not a God of the gaps. It's not an argument from ignorance. And there's actually a philosopher, a historian of science, Michael Shermer, who very explicitly accuses the ID people, the people making the case for intelligent design, of making an argument from ignorance. And he says, well, they're just saying that natural processes can't produce information, or it can't produce irreducible complexity, therefore God did it. Well, first of all, we're not making the argument quite that simplistically. We're not arguing in the first instance for God, but merely for an intelligence of some kind. But secondly, the way he represents our argument is a straw man. We're not arguing that just because we are arguing that natural processes are insufficient to produce specific effects in nature, irreducible complexity, specified complexity. But we are not arguing from that directly to the notion of intelligent design. There's he's missing a premise in the way we formulate the argument. We're arguing that natural processes of various kinds, chance, necessity, combination, the two, are insufficient to produce information, this is the way I would formulate the argument, based on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, and also there is a cause of which we know that is capable of producing that effect. And therefore, when we survey the landscape of possible causes, intelligent design is the best explanation, okay? Provides the best, most causally adequate explanation. So the claim that ID people are arguing from ignorance, or this represents a God of the gaps argument, is really, it's based on a straw man representation of the argument. And that's just, I think, something worth noting. Now that's what I did yesterday. And what I'd like to do now is give you a little background on how I came to the importance of inference to the best explanation as a mode of reasoning in the historical sciences. And then from there, I'd like to segue to a discussion of how this method of reasoning can be used to formulate credible and persuasive, and I think theistic arguments, but arguments that also have a kind of integrity, and that we're not overstating our case, claiming a proof in the geometric sense that is not available from any kind of a posteriori argument based on nature, okay, because I think there are limits there. All right, so I'm just going to toggle to another PowerPoint. Okay, so if we think about different forms of reasoning, I taught a course when I was a professor at Whitworth University for a number of years called Reasons for Faith. And one of the first things I did is I started by defining different notions of reason, because there are, and this is, I think, where the church in its history has run into some problems in its articulation of the relationship between faith and reason, is that there are actually different types of reasoning. And if people think of reason as only a deductive enterprise, then you're stuck making certain kinds of arguments that may be difficult to pull off. And so one form of reasoning is obviously deductive reasoning. And the great thing about deductive syllogisms is that if the premises are true and the structure is valid, then you get a nice certain conclusion. But it's actually pretty difficult to generate arguments about that of that kind in most real-life situations. Another form of reasoning is obviously inductive reasoning and inductive inference, which is used in the sciences, but not as much as people think, because hypothesis testing involves more than just making inductive leaps. And inductive reasoning, in deductive reasoning, you're moving. Well, in inductive reasoning, obviously, we're moving from this specific case to the general. Deductive reasoning applies a generalization to a specific case. Abductive reasoning caught my attention and interest because it's a form of reasoning that is oddly, it's formally fallacious, and yet it's used all the time. And it's used especially in forensic and historical investigations where you're wanting to move from an effect back to a cause, where you're moving retrodictively. So C.S. Peirce, the American logician, was perhaps one of the first people to characterize this in detail. And this is his formulation of an abductive inference. The surprising fact C is observed, but if A had occurred, then C would be a matter of course. Hence, there is reason to suspect that A occurred. Now, the way Peirce formulates this is not fallacious, because he qualifies it with there is a reason to suspect, or we could say perhaps A occurred. But if we were to just say the surprising fact C occurred, if A then C, therefore A, we'd be committing the deductive fallacy of affirming the consequent, okay? So this was one of the first things that presented itself to me in my research. How could something that is fallacious be crucial to a form of scientific investigation? But it's, you know, it is what it is. So you've got, you know, if you have a boot print on the moon, and that's the only piece of evidence you have, how do you explain that? Well, in abductive inference, well, the footprint implies a foot, you know. So if someone stepped on the moon, you know, the surprising fact footprint is observed. But if someone stepped on the moon, a footprint would exist as a matter of course. Therefore, we have a reason to suspect that someone stepped on the moon. You know, this is the abductive approach. So if you remove the qualifications that Peirce provides, you end up with the fallacious form. If A, then C, C occurred, therefore, I didn't get it, the fallacious form. If A, then C, C, if A, then C, C, affirming the, what am I, I've got, it's the other way around, yeah, sorry. Yeah, then C occurred, yeah, okay. Anyway, the point, here's, let's do it with a nice, get rid of the symbols, okay? It's always easier. If it rains, the streets get wet. The streets are wet, therefore it rained. All right, that's classic, fallacious affirming of the consequent, and yet there's an inferential structure here that's commonly used. It suggests ourselves. And so this is fallacious because, and the reason it's fallacious is, philosophers, affirming the consequent is the name for it, right? But what's the problem logically?
There could be another explanation.
There could be other causes, right? There could be other possible causes, right? And the streets there might have been a fire hydrant that exploded. We might have had another form of precipitation. You know, there could be any number of reasons that the streets are wet other than it having rained. And when you keep in mind what makes this fallacious, it also suggests a strategy for reducing the underdetermination. You're familiar with that term? There's the underdetermination of theory by data we sometimes talk about. In this case, we have underdetermination of causes vis-a-vis effects. We've got one effect, but there's many possible causes that could explain it. So the method of inference to the best explanation, in a sense, confronts that problem directly, or the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And it says, okay, if the problem of abductive inference, and you can see how useful abduction could be, because it would allow us to say things about the past even if we weren't there to see it, moving from effect back to cause. But if the problem of this kind of reasoning is that you have more than one possible cause explaining the same effect, then maybe we can take that problem head on and compare the possible causes as to their explanatory power based on other things we might know or come to know, thereby reducing that causal underdetermination. You follow the sense of this. And that then allows us to make much stronger claims, more epistemically warranted claims, even if we're still dealing with a logical structure that doesn't allow us to have certainty as a deductive inference would have. Okay? And so this is a form of, in a sense, practical scientific reasoning, practical legal reasoning, practical forensic reasoning that's used all the time. And I have a really silly little illustration for you, just to get it across. Okay, so we've got so we have the multiple competing hypotheses. The problem with abduction, you've got multiple possible causes which could explain the same effect. What do you do when you're confronted with that? Well, in real life, in practical, ordinary reasoning about lots of things, what we try to do is get more information that would allow us more, if we have the effects and the causes separate, we want to get more information about the effects, the relevant effects, gather more information, and in the process we hope to be able to eliminate some of the possible causes and in the best of cases eventually come to one. All right? So I have a good little illustration of this. You got a wet driveway and a wet car, and I'm going to just put this on my lap. And so you've got some possible explanations from of these two facts. Maybe it rained, maybe the sprinklers went off, maybe somebody washed the car. So initially, with just those two facts of the wet driveway and wet car, you're in a situation of underdetermination. You've got many more explanations than you have, or many more causes than possible causes than one. But then you start adding some additional facts. There's a clear sky. Now that seems to count against the rain hypothesis. And you also have a dry lawn and a dry street. Now that really counts against the rain hypothesis because rain, as best we know, is based on our experience, does not typically concentrate its effects on things as small as a single driveway or automobile. Okay? So we then, based on our background knowledge, are able to eliminate the rain hypothesis, and we end up with now two possible causes. The sprinklers went off or someone washed the car. We're still in an underdetermined state. We look for some more evidence, and then we see the bucket and the soapy water next to the car, and so conclude that someone washed the car, that we infer this is the best explanation. Now this is kind of a homespun little example, but all the basic principles are in play here, in particular causal adequacy and our background knowledge of those cause and effect structures. We know something about the kind of effects that rain clouds produce, and they typically don't the rain does not usually concentrate it on one little tiny automobile, okay? So that seems implausible to us as an explanation based on our cause and effects knowledge of the world. And when I formulated the case for design yesterday, I appealed to that cause and effect structure, cause and effect, our knowledge of cause and effect, when I said that that minds, we know, are capable of producing functional information, whereas, for example, law-like processes of chemistry don't do that. They produce crystals, maybe, with highly redundant, repetitive structures, but they don't produce these aperiodic structures that also convey meaning or functional information. So that's the sketch of the method. So this doesn't produce certainty, right? Because maybe there'll be additional information that will come along, some additional facts that will come along later that will require us to revise our assessment of what constitutes the best explanation. But given the facts on the table at any given time, it's possible to make provisional inferences that are less underdetermined, less uncertain than a simple abductive inference would allow you to make. And this is where the phrase, in the courts of law come, beyond reasonable doubt. There's a point where the facts of the matter pile up, and we are able to make judgments that, we don't have geometric, this kind of certainty you get in geometry, but we still put people behind bars because you do reach a point where the convergence of evidence is such that really there is only one plausible explanation. So obviously there's elements of judgment in this, but this is, I think, an interesting middle way between the fideism. Well, I'm already getting ahead of the story because I want to talk about how this applies to God arguments, but it gets ahead of, or it strikes a middle way between the genuine uncertainty you have with a merely plausible abductive inference and a deductive proof, okay? And then applying this again theologically, if we think about these two extremes in the Church's understanding of the relationship between faith and reason, we've had on one hand, we've had fideism, which says we have faith and faith alone, and there are no reasons that we can offer for faith, so that there's no cognitive element in belief, and then claims that go beyond what human reason can actually do with some kinds of deductive proofs. Now, I'm not against deductive arguments because I think deductive arguments can have epistemic force without providing perfect proof, but that's another story. Okay, so now let's get a little more specific and move to the discussion now of how this can be used in formulating theistic arguments. And actually, I don't want to present this as sort of a general treatise on that subject, but I have a particular theistic argument that I've developed. And I'm going to just sketch it informally and then let you look at a few slides. The case for intelligent design based on biology does not establish the existence of God, even as a best explanation. And the reason for that is that there's other possible explanations for the intelligence. There are other possible intelligences besides God's that might explain the information content of a biological system. I mean, it is at least logically possible, even if it is a little bit implausible or maybe might make us laugh, that a being within the cosmos, an immanent intelligence, could be responsible for the evidence of design we see in life. If you're persuaded of my argument from design, then the next question is, who is the designing intelligence responsible for those evidences of design? And it is at least logically possible that that agent could be an immanent intelligence. Now, when we're talking about life arising 3.85 billion years ago, clearly it wasn't a human agent. So, this is why Richard Dawkins in the film Expelled actually speculated that, well, maybe there is a signature of intelligence in life, but if there is, it would have had to have been an intelligence within the cosmos which itself evolved. And so he posits essentially a space alien intelligence. Okay, so it's a possible explanation. But I contend that when you bring other evidences of design into the picture, when you expand the data set, okay, so you have evidence of biological design, and you could invoke an immanent intelligence or a transcendent intelligence to explain that. But then when you bring in other evidences from physics and cosmology, then you're able to, those evidences, I think, in the same way that the car wash example ended up pointing you towards one explanation is better than another, I think those then weight the argument towards a theistic designer. Because, for example, with the fine-tuning argument, the evidence of fine-tuning from the very beginning of the universe is clearly something that any agent within the universe subject to those laws of physics could not have accounted for. And so I think when you bring fine-tuning and also the evidence for design in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics from the very beginning of the universe into that set of data we're trying to explain, that the two together make a very compelling evidence for theism. They end up defeating the space alien hypothesis. But then there's also the possibility of a deistic intelligence. Is it a theistic God or a deistic God? That's where the two together, deism could explain fine-tuning design from the beginning, but it doesn't explain evidence of design that arises after the beginning of the universe, because a deistic creator, by definition, is acting to put the universe in motion, but then does not do anything from that point forward. So as you expand the set of important scientific data points, it becomes possible, I argue, to show that theism is the best metaphysical hypothesis to explain an ensemble of scientific evidences. And in fact, I look at three key pieces of data. The evidence for the definite beginning of the universe as attested by Big Bang cosmology and general relativity, the evidence of fine-tuning as attested from modern physics, and then the evidence of design in biology as explained yesterday in our debate. Okay, so that's the kind of the argument. And let me show you how we can depict oops, oh no, we lost our. So people often ask me, the work I do on design in biology, are you arguing for God's existence? I say no, I'm arguing for an intelligent designer of some kind. But having argued for that argument and that conclusion, or that evidence that justifies that conclusion, can form a plank in a larger case for theism. It can be an element in a multi-pronged case for theism, a cumulative argument from several. What happened here? Sorry. We're not that big a group. Okay. So if we have some evidence from nature, that's the explanandum, okay, the thing that needs to be explained, and then we generate some metaphysical hypotheses. All right. I'm not claiming this is scientific, and I really don't care because I'm anti-demarcationist, whether you call it scientific or metaphysical hypothesis, but it makes a lot of people feel better if we call them metaphysical hypotheses, and certainly they are. These are worldviews. And so what I did, and Poi and Jamie have been through my class on this, but I look at deism, naturalism, pantheism, and theism as oh, thank you. That's helpful. As you know, some of the big worldview, the big systems of thought, and ask which of those best explain the three key evidences that I just cited: the evidence of the Big Bang singularity, the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, and the evidence for design in biology. And it's possible to kind of reason this through. We've already seen deism is going to have trouble with the evidence for design in biology after t equals 0. Naturalism or materialism has trouble with all three of those pieces of evidence, interestingly, because the design evidence in biology requires a mind. Naturalism denies a mind prior to nature. The cosmological evidence is especially problematic for the naturalistic or materialistic worldview, because when you get back in this way, I have to go through some of the science here, but Stephen Hawking, 1968, solves the field equations of general relativity, implies that as you go back in time, finite distance in time, at some point in the finite past, the curvature of space-time reaches an infinite, which corresponds to zero spatial volume, which leaves a problem for the materialist, because so I used to ask my undergrads, how much stuff can you put in zero space? Essentially, the picture of the origin of the universe generated by general relativity is that of a true spatial and temporal singularity out of which all matter comes, because there is no matter at the beginning that could provide a materialistic causal explanation of the origin of the universe. So materialism is causally inadequate to explain that Big Bang singularity. It also denies the existence of a mind, and if the fine-tuning implies intelligence or mind or conscious activity, materialism has trouble there. So as you walk through the different worldviews, each one of them, I contend, ends up having a problem explaining one or more of these key pieces of evidence. In each case, it's a lack of causal adequacy, such that when you get to, such that you can make an inference to theism, as I have these little worldview pictures I use with undergrads, and So yeah, this is a depiction of the Hawking's solution to the general relativity, the idea that you got this singularity, and so you have cosmological beginning, and then the fine-tuning, and then the evidence of biological design, and then at the end of the process, you're able to make an inference to the best explanation for theism. Okay, that's kind of a rough sketch of the argument. Sorry, it's holding a computer in front of you. So now, one other aspect of this. Each one of these, this inference, there's an inferential structure here. At one level, you have, for example, the debate about design and biology. I need to make the theistic argument work. I need to establish that there's evidence of intelligent design in biology. It's a crucial plank in the argument. Well, you don't just get that's not a given as a fact. That itself is the result of an assessment of competing explanations. So in each case, there's a scientific debate that underlies the bigger metaphysical debate. And in the anthropic area, you've got the theistic design hypothesis, and it has a competitor hypothesis too. It's the multiverse, all right? And in cosmology, you have the theistic interpretation of the singularity, and you have something called quantum cosmology as a competing hypothesis. So to get to, in a sense, to the second level, where you can treat the singularity and the fine-tuning and the evidence of design in biology, to treat them as facts, you have to go through a prior assessment of competing explanatory power. Okay? Now, that sounds like, well, you would never actually be able to do that, but actually it's a wonderful intellectual exercise, and it also, I think, does continually lead in this theistic direction. Let me illustrate with the fine-tuning arguments. So the competing idea to theistic design at the fine-tuning level is this multiverse idea. And an awful lot of people, if you're aware of the multiverse, is the idea that, well, you have this incredible improbable. Everyone aware of the fine-tuning? Is that a common? Okay, so you've got the laws and constants of physics have these very particular values that turn out to be necessary for life. And in addition, the initial conditions of the universe have these very particular configurations that turn out to be necessary for life. And so Fred Hoyle, leading previously agnostic physicist, said, after a number of these things had been discovered, said a common sense interpretation is that the super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. He actually became a theist as a result of a fine-tuning parameter that he discovered, the resonance levels of carbon. But since then, there have been two different cosmological or physical models that have suggested the possibility of multiple universes. And those multiple universes have been invoked to explain the fine-tuning in the following way, saying, well, yeah, we are in a universe that looks incredibly improbable, but if there are enough universes out there generating different sets of initial conditions and fine-tuning parameters, some universe like ours would eventually have to arise, and we just happen to be in the lucky ones. We're the lucky ones, and so it's our awareness of the fine-tuning is kind of an observer-dependent phenomenon. It's a selection effect. Okay, we're just the lucky ones. Okay, so which of those hypotheses is better? Okay, I'm saying that there's evidence of theistic design in the fine-tuning, but to get to that point, I have to have this prior argument, all right, or prior assessment. And in a sense, every person who wants to investigate what the evidence has to say about the God question is invited, but also has to go through that process of deliberation for himself or herself. I love this stuff. I think this really works. I think this is a really powerful case for theism, but you have to have the patience to go through the steps. So here's let me illustrate how this is played out in the fine-tuning area, because I think it's a very exciting development intellectually. There are two separate cosmological theories, or physical theories, that would make it possible to conceive of these multiverses. Okay, one is called inflationary cosmology, and that's one physical theory, and another is string theory. Okay, and each of them render the multiverse at least superficially plausible. Now, this is all in the realm of theoretical physics. We don't ever get, there's no way we'll ever see a multiverse, right? And they are inherently unverifiable. But in the direct sense of observational evidence, so is God, right? So if we don't refute the multiverse by saying, well, it can't be, you can't verify other universes empirically, because the quick rejoinder to that is, well, you can't see God either, so, you know, we're at parity there. I'm convinced, and I have colleagues working in the philosophy of physics who are doing some really cutting-edge stuff on this, that nevertheless there are still compelling reasons to prefer the theistic design hypothesis over and against the multiverse. Let me give you a couple. It turns out that these two are we back? So no, we're not projecting. It just didn't. What happened?
Don't you need to send to the projector?
If anyone has knowledge of that, yeah, go ahead. I think there's a biblical verse that says the devil is in the PowerPoint. So. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm going to keep going with multiverse and let these guys figure out the tech. Okay, so. Okay, super. I'm about to wrap up. So, anyway, there are two separate physical theories that generate the possibility of the multiverse. Turns out that one of them could conceivably explain the origin of the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe. The inflationary cosmology explains the fine-tuning of the initial conditions. It could generate other universes that would have the same laws of physics with the same fine-tuning parameters, but would generate different arrangements of matter. Okay? The other theory, string theory, explains the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, but not the initial conditions. So you've got, right away, you've got a difficulty of simplicity, of an Occam's razor type difficulty. And I have a slide here, which I do hope we can get. It says 7 incredulous things before breakfast. And the basic idea is that if you opt for the multiverse, you have to accept a whole bunch of pure theoretical postulates, as a whole group of them, as opposed to the one theoretical postulate of a rational omnipotent deity in the case of the theistic design hypothesis. So the theistic design hypothesis is a whole lot simpler and more coherent. And I say more coherent because it's not clear that the inflationary cosmology in the string theoretic landscape can be made into one seamless physical system. Might be, but that's not clear yet. So let me just find this slide and I'll turn it around. Okay, no problem. Okay, so you got to believe you have to believe in inflaton fields, and you have to believe in strings, and you have to believe in multi-dimensional reality in string theory, and you have to also believe that every compactification of a string corresponds to a particular set of fine-tuning parameters in an additional universe. And you have to believe in all those other universes as well. So it's, you know, what it was the Occam phrase, don't multiply theoretical entities. This is a really profligate metaphysical landscape. There's lots of stuff you've got to believe in order to explain the fine-tuning, which could be explained with the singular simple postulate of a theistic designer. Okay, so that's an argument. I think it has some force, but simplicity criteria are not dispositive in all philosophical arguments. But it's a cool. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Here's I think a more compelling thing. In both. Whoa, Jamie, great job. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to lift this. Be careful, okay? And I'm going to toggle to another PowerPoint. These are actually keynotes. Do you like them? I had someone help me with them. They're kind of cool. In order to generate new universes, you have the shutoff energy of the inflaton field has to be finely tuned. The idea of the inflationary cosmology is that it's an analogy to the change in energy levels in quantum mechanics. So if you drop an energy level, you spit out a photon or something. So you change it, if you have a finely tuned inflaton shutoff energy, you spit off a universe. That's this idea. So the many worlds hypothesis, the three key problems. The models for producing the new universes either don't provide a mechanism for varying the laws and constants of physics, or they don't provide a mechanism for varying the initial conditions. So you need two physical theories to generate this, with speculative cosmologies attached to both, which generates all these pure theoretical postulates. But the second, and I think more telling problem, is that both of the universe-generating mechanisms, the string theoretic landscape and the inflaton field, require themselves fine-tuning. So in order to explain fine-tuning, you've just pushed the fine-tuning issue back one generation. And there's another problem with it, which I think in the interest of time, I just won't go into all of these things. But the point is that in the big picture, as you're doing this kind of reasoning, you have to take on these individual hypotheses and address the counter-arguments. But I think in each case, there are good reasons to prefer the conclusion that is either theistic or has theistic implications. And so it is possible to conclude, yeah, there was a singularity, there was evidence of theistic design in the fine-tuning, and there is evidence of design in biology. Now, when you take all that together, then you can make that higher level inference to theism as the best explanation for the ensemble of evidences. And I think you've got a very good theistic argument, though again, not a proof, but you're in a lot better position than taking a leap of faith.